Housers, welcome to another episode of On the Way Home. I am your host, Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door. Blue Door is one of the groups, one of the organizations that put this podcast together, doing great work in York Region, Durham Region, and Peel Region for 41 years now. You can learn all about the work that my team at Blue Door is doing at bluedoor.ca. We're doing some really cool stuff around construction social enterprise, different types of housing, our inclusion, IN inclusion program for 2S LGBTQ plus youth, and many, many more things. So check us out at bluedoor.ca. And if you want to get involved, that's where you can find out more. We do not do this podcast alone. It is in partnership with our great friends at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. They are doing game-changing work day in, day out, advocacy work, training. They put on a giant conference in Halifax that our guests today will be at, and that's in November. So check out all the stuff they're doing at caeh.ca. And you sign up for the conference. You can sign up to become a Built for Zero community. And let me tell you, that's what you want to do to get to that functional zero for homelessness. And you can sign up for pieces where they make it very easy for you to advocate for different policies to change that will help end homelessness across our country. Let's talk about today's guests. Do I have one guest? No. Do I have two guests? No, I have three guests, and they're all from Humane Canada, and they are young leaders. I felt I was very inspired. I always get inspired by young people. Like all three of these individuals are working hard, have high levels of education, are passionate, and it's just really inspiring. They're from Humane Canada, and we had Sue, Andrea, and Claire from Humane Canada. They're working on something called the ACT project. So working together with the Canadian Violence Link Coalition, the ACT project, which stands for Awareness, Collaboration, the Tools Project. The ACT project seeks to address systemic barriers for women with animals that are fleeing violence, right? Their companions, often women have to leave their animals behind just because they have to leave in a hurry, and that is their family. And also because there's not a lot of options for them to flee to that are safe and affordable, that they can keep their family, their animals with them going forward, right? And so they're doing a lot of work around looking at different models, talking with different partners, working through it. They're trying to come up with a model for those impacted fleeing violence with their animals, whether it be the survivor animals, service providers, animal welfare workers, all these different partners coming together to kind of put together that model. We talk a lot about that today. We talk about their journey into this work. We talk about what Humane Canada does. We talk about the ACT project, the process they've gone through so far, what's happened so far, some of their learnings, and what their hopes are for the future. It's a great conversation with three young, brilliant leaders that you don't want to miss. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Let's go to that conversation now. Sue, Andrea, Claire, thank you so much for making the time today to come on the pod. So happy to have you here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. So excited to be here.
Cool. That was almost coordinated, all three at the same time. You almost said, this is such a tight group that they already know who's going to say what beforehand. And so with this question, we're going to leave it up to you. And you talked about this beforehand. The question that we ask all of our people that come on the podcast, and that is, what does home mean to you?
So we actually all have an individual answer to this, and I'm going to get us started. When I think of home, I think of a safe, accessible place where you spend your time and share with those you love, which may be human or animal household members. I also want to acknowledge, though, that safe, accessible, affordable housing is increasingly inaccessible for many individuals and families across Canada. And I'm going to pass it to Claire.
Thank you. Yeah, the first thing that come to mind when I think of home are certainly my dog and my partner. We live together in a few different places now, and I can definitely see how having my family with me makes it feel like my home really could be anywhere. But when I think more about it, I can really recognize that the feeling of home isn't necessarily connected to a specific person or a specific place or even a specific animal, but rather that feeling of safety and the ability to be with loved ones, human or animal, and the freedom to express my authentic self. and I'll pass it over to Andrea.
Thanks, Claire. When I think of the word home, I think of a safe place, of joy, of the ability to express myself freely, to be vulnerable. I think of connection to my loved ones and an overall sense of belonging. And like Sue, I recognize that this isn't the case for many people. And having grown up, I wouldn't describe my home at that time as such, but it's a space now that I've had time and space to cultivate and nest in.
Love that. And thank you for those answers. There is no right or wrong answer, but you always see the themes of safety, comfort, family.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, we saw a bit of a theme of animals too. And we'll tell you why in a minute, why that's important. But before we get into that, we always like to learn a little bit about our guests. So we're asking each of you to just take us through the journey of how you got into this work.
Sure, I can start off that question. So I feel that I'm on a lot of different journeys, but given my lived experience being a first-gen Asian American and Canadian, I saw the systemic barriers like systemic racism that my parents faced as newcomers. So this, along with a lot of other factors, instilled in me a drive to help and support communities. And so I worked with a variety of marginalized communities over 7 years as a social worker, and I saw this common recurrent theme of social injustice and systemic issues that all of these communities faced. So then I got my master's in social work with a goal of wanting to support and aid in the transformation of these systems. And that's actually when I became a practicum student with Humane Canada with the ACT Project. And now I'm fortunate enough to be a coordinator with the ACT Project, where I can engage in more of that systems level work.
I will go next to answer that. So the journey that I have had working in the sector of gender-based violence and animal welfare began with my own lived experience of gender-based violence. I wish to continue to center other survivor voices in this space. As a survivor, I was fortunate to be able to access support services, and that helped me to safely leave a violent relationship and rebuild my life. I became really passionate about advocating for fellow survivors of gender-based violence and began to work in spaces to build gender-based violence programs and services that were trauma-informed and survivor-centered. And then from working in leadership in gender-based violence services, I came to Humane Canada to work as the coordinator of the ACT Project. And I'm now grateful for the opportunity to manage the ACT Project. I'm currently pursuing a master's in women and gender studies to continue to build on my knowledge and to better address systemic barriers for facing survivors.
And I'll take it away after Sue. So I came to the ACT Project predominantly with a background in animal welfare, but really having a robust passion for the area that's the intersection between animal and human welfare. So I worked throughout pretty much my whole undergrad in Thunder Bay, Ontario at the local Humane Society, where I really got to see the profound impact that access to affordable veterinary care had on animals and their people. And this, combined with coordinating a free pet food delivery program as part of a COVID-19 relief effort, made me really passionate about providing services that could help to support people and their animals staying together through times of hardship. I actually started at Humane Canada part-time as the coordinator for the National Pet Food Bank. And then I was lucky enough to get brought on board with the ACT Project as a coordinator for that project as well. So I'm really grateful that my work has led me here and to be able to contribute to this really meaningful project.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. And so glad. And you know what? It's really inspiring to see younger people like yourselves like killing it in education and taking that education and doing really impactful and important work. So thank you. I want to tell you a quick story about animals and in housing, right? So many years ago, we had this drop-in center when I worked at 360 Kids, then known as Pathways, and we had one of our youth came in, and someone saw some movement in his backpack, and they discovered it was actually a rat, and it was his pet rat. Now, right away, the first response to a rat is a bit of a freak out by some of the staff, and how could it be? How can? But when he explained it to them that it was his pet, and it was his only family, it changed everything. It was a game changer, and it made us really think of family can take many forms. And when it comes to animals, I mean, I think I'm preaching to the converted, but when it comes to animals, I mean, so many people, as we could, Andrea, so you talked about lived experience too, where many people have let us down in lives, in fact, hurt us, where animals don't let us down, don't hurt us. I mean, it's that the love that they bring. And then others might wonder, if you had to, like when you're forced to make that choice of you can't come inside or you can't access this housing program, if you have a pet, that kind of thing, why they choose not to, right? Of course not. Because the question becomes, would you leave your family outside? And the answer, of course, is no. So they're not going to do that either. So let's talk about, with that kind of quick story there, let's talk about Humane Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about it? How did it start? What is its purpose and mission?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take that one away. So, Humane Canada is Canada's national federation of SPCAs and humane societies, which represents more than 50 humane societies and SPCAs across the country in every province and in 2 of our 3 Canadian territories. So, the mission of Humane Canada is to end animal cruelty, improve animal protection, and promote the humane treatment of all animals. And because many of Humane Canada's members investigate and enforce the animal cruelty sections of the criminal code, we have a lot of frontline knowledge of the violence link, which is the relationship between violence against people and violence against animals. So within Humane Canada, we have the Criminal Justice System Reform Program, which works to raise awareness about the violence link and to support legislative and policy amendments that will create lasting change in Canada's animal welfare landscape. And we also have the Canadian Violence Link Coalition, which is our project, the ACT project, works with the Canadian Violence Link Coalition to address systemic barriers for women with animals experiencing gender-based violence. So our work gives us an understanding of gender-based violence really from an animal welfare perspective, and it intersects with access to housing as a basic right for both humans and animals alike.
Very cool. Wow. Thank you for that. And you just mentioned the ACT project. Can you elaborate a little bit on the ACT project? Why was it created? How long has it been around? What are some of the activities?
Yeah, I can explain I can begin by explaining like what the ACT project is overall. So we are a national project that seeks to address those systemic barriers within support services that for survivors with animals experiencing gender-based violence. So ACT stands for awareness, collaboration, and tools. And when we speak of animals, this includes companions or pet animals, farmed animals, so women might earn an income from those relationships, and service animals. And so our project is funded by the Department of Wage, which is Women and Gender Equality. And we're really aligned with that department in our goal of wanting to address and remove systemic barriers for survivors and their families. In terms of why ACT was created, you touched a little bit on it with your story of, family of animals being family and not being recognized as that. But Claire also mentioned the violence link. So, we do know that there is a link between violence towards animals and violence towards humans, and that there's an overlap between that animal abuse and then other forms of violence like intimate partner violence. And so in instances of domestic violence, when there's a pet in the home, there are higher reports of animal abuse being commonly documented. So for like one statistic, 1 out of 8 survivors in Canada report experiencing threatened or enacted violence against their animals. We also know that many women experiencing gender-based violence may, like you mentioned, may view animals as the primary source of support. They may view them as family members, and that has been validated by our conversations with survivors, with the stories they have chosen to share with us, as well as within the literature. And if you have that lived experience, you have a pet, you can probably testify to that bond and the strength of it as well. But unfortunately, in those really harmful and abusive relationships, we see aggressors using that bond for coercion. So using it for things like keeping the survivor silent about the abuse, or preventing them from leaving. And we've heard that many survivors may actually delay leaving because of their animals and may consider returning back because their animals remained in that situation. So then if, after all of this, if a survivor does leave, then they can face those systemic barriers. So it's kind of like one thing after another for survivors. They may struggle to find supports, especially in rural, remote, farming, and northern communities. Across Canada, the law is that animals are considered property. So survivors may struggle for legal custody of their animals. And then there's also this societal attitude of victim blaming and shaming when survivors do decide to disclose. Additionally, I believe Claire brought up about how our work intersects with access to housing. And so when we look at housing for survivors and their animals, there's no clear standardized approach to housing across Canada for the allowance of pets in homes. So then this creates situations where survivors have to remain living with their abusers and at continued real risk of harm. Further, there's a lack of funding for animal safekeeping programs, and these are programs that keep survivors and animals together after leaving violence. And then really, based on all of these barriers, and there's more that we can't touch on just given our time, this is the reality that survivors can face. So there's a real need to respond to this and advocate for better outcomes. And we're hoping that through the ACT project, we can address those various pieces.
Amazing. And so what I want to know now is, you're doing this work. Can you walk me through the process of putting the project together? Who's all been involved?
Absolutely. We have been incredibly lucky in this project to work with numerous partners in both human and animal services that have supported building the ACT to Keep Families Safe model, as well as the online learning center that we will be launching in October. So I want to start by saying the foundation of this project was built by Jasmine Ferreira, the previous manager of the project, and she is a current PhD candidate at York University. This work actually began with 12 stakeholder partners from both animal and human service organizations from municipal, provincial, and national perspectives. These stakeholders were organizations that were already working with Humane Canada regarding the link between gender-based violence and animal abuse. And I want to note here, though, there was one exception, and that exception was Women at the Center, which is a national survivor-led organization. We actually approached them to join the project because of the incredible work that they're doing, and we wanted to include and center survivor voices from the beginning of this project. So these stakeholders came together and worked with us to complete a social network analysis and create a systems map of all the systems that survivors of gender-based violence and their animals may interact with in their journey, as well as to highlight leaders and champions in this work. So we had a long list of leaders and champions, and we were limited by time and budget. I do want to note that. But we reached out to leaders and champions and asked them to join on to the project as partners, which we had 28 additional organizations become project partners from across Canada, and again, both animal and human services. With these 40 total partners, we completed a gap analysis to look for existing strengths with organizations that are already doing work with survivors and animals, as well as limitations for organizations that are wishing to work with survivors and animals, opportunities within communities to further this work that's already happening, as well as challenges within communities for where this work hasn't been able to get started. From that analysis, we were able to meet again with our 12 stakeholder partners, and together with them designed an adaptable collaborative response model, which is our ACT to Keep Families Safe model. We then shared this model for feedback to ensure it was meaningful and adaptable through community conversations with survivors, official language minority communities, Indigenous communities, and remote and rural communities. We then adapted and adjusted the model to be inclusive of this feedback. And then since those consultations, we have been building and putting into practice the building blocks of our model, including building educational modules, resources, and collecting case studies that will all be launched in our online learning center. We also began to host a community of practice to offer space for leaders and champions to learn together and to network. I just want to highlight our next community of practice will be in October. We have been focusing our energy towards advocacy, including putting together a submission for the Federal Housing Advocate to highlight the need for accessible, affordable, safe, animal-friendly housing, as we had heard from survivors and organizations across the country that there's a need to have housing for survivors to move forward to once they have utilized the services of an animal safekeeping program. And I do want to note, we have an extensive list of partners on our website, and I encourage folks to check this out to learn more about these incredible organizations that we've been able to work with. I am not going to list them though, as that would take up a significant amount of time, and there's a lot for us to discuss on this podcast.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there is a lot to discuss. And so all these stakeholders that you have, what have you been hearing from them? Any surprises as you've gone about this work?
I can answer that. When I began supporting the ACT project as a student, my first day was a roundtable stakeholder consultation, and I was thrown right into it, and it was great. But I just remember being really pleasantly surprised with how supportive and eager the partners were to engage with us and within the project. And I'm coming from a background where I was on the front line and had to advocate every day, and that felt like an uphill battle. But entering this project, I felt like I was surrounded by people who had that same goal in mind, that we wanted to really center survivor voices. We wanted to center their animals as well. I think another thing we should acknowledge is that we're not starting all of this from scratch, that there are survivors, service providers, communities who have really paved the way for us to take on this project. And that's because of their adaptation to and their resistance against systemic barriers. And we've really seen how amazing and innovative and creative their responses have been. So I also wanted to share that we're, like Sue mentioned, through the case studies, we will have case studies of ways agencies have co-sheltered survivors and animals together, or of how they have kept animals safe off-site. And again, that will be shared through our upcoming online learning center.
I'm going to share some of the results from those conversations that we were having, because we were so fortunate to witness many rich discussions of our stakeholders. So these discussions did emphasize the importance and the need for survivors with animals to have programs to support them. But they also offered some unexpected areas for further advocacy. So one of those areas was regarding survivors with disabilities, and looking at the need to better support survivors with service animals, as well as to create more of an understanding about emotional support animals. In Canada, service animals fall under provincial legislation, which does differ from province to province. Oftentimes, though, survivors may flee from one province to another due to safety concerns, due to their community being in another province, or various other reasons. And this means that survivors with service animals may face barriers and discrimination in another province when trying to access services. There's also a need to recognize and acknowledge and advocate regarding trans women and non-binary individuals, as they are experiencing high rates of gender-based violence, and there are many challenges and barriers for accessing services for these survivors. Now, we also heard from rural, remote, northern, reserve, fly-in, and farming communities that they have very different experiences, very different barriers, and very different access to services. And our stakeholders informed us that there are different considerations in these spaces about confidentiality and safety within these communities. And we're actually going to have an educational module launching in our online learning center specifically to focus on these barriers and considerations. One of the surprises of this project, which kind of came up in your story about the pet rat, was the wide variety of animals that survivors may be responsible for or have a relationship with. and the need to ensure that these relationships are thought of when designing these animal safekeeping programs. Additionally, animals, like Andrea mentioned, are legally considered property in Canada, and this can actually create a pretty big barrier for survivors who may not view their relationship with animals through that lens, or may not have access or the ability to safely access proof of ownership, which can create another barrier for accessing services. We also heard over and over again about the importance of building networks of collaboration. This work cannot be done alone, and there's a need for cross-sectoral support between animal and human services to share our knowledge, our expertise, our resources to be able to best support survivors with animals. But we also heard the need to educate and raise awareness within communities so family members, friends, and community members can offer support to survivors and have a deeper understanding about gender-based violence. And finally, I want to highlight, we also heard from our stakeholders about the need to include Francophone voices and have collaborative partnerships between Anglophone and Francophone services and offer services and resources in both languages.
That's amazing. I'm wondering if you could share, you talked about because there's not one way to do this, right? We're finding out different ways. And I want to shout out to my partner, Sylvia Braithwaite, who works with Fred Victor. Fred Victor, very early on, years ago, before it was in Shelter Standards, at their Caledon site, had allowed pets. And they were the only, right? And so they did that. And it wasn't Sylvia who drove that, but she is a huge proponent and wanted to make sure I was so proud of that, right? And so they do that. And there's different rules around it. If it's a larger dog, you have to keep it in a cage, or if the dog might have tendencies to bite people, you have to have a muzzle on it. But it generally works without a lot of incidents. Others might have, I know sometimes people will talk about, okay, can we have people board your pet? Not a big fan. I'll be honest, right? Because the whole thing we're talking about here is that's family. Why would I board my family somewhere else? But to keep them safe, or work with, as you talked about, working with animal services too, right? That crossover, and that's part of the challenge too. I think when people say, okay, we're going to make this work, we're going to make sure we have policies that support that. However, what happens when the pet gets sick, or what if we can't get food, or what if we? And Claire, you talked about that crossover. So I've asked a lot of questions in there, but what are some of the models that you've seen that have worked and worked well?
So I'll take that one. So we definitely want to say that co-sheltering is ideal. It is what's best for animals. It's what's best for their humans. It can be really traumatic for both the animal and the human to have to separate. But we like to look at this as a journey for organizations, and some folks are starting a little bit earlier on that journey. And so that's where there's some really cool programs out there that we're going to highlight, where it's a gender-based violence shelter working with an SPCA to foster the animal during the time period where the survivor is in shelter. There's also programs where gender-based violence services are working with dog boarding or cat boarding or animal boarding facilities to support there. And so those are some really cool programs. But I think one of the reasons we keep highlighting that this work can't be done alone and has to be done in collaboration is because even when we have co-sheltering, there's those things that come up of animals getting sick or needing food. And that's where there's such incredible expertise on the side of animal welfare, where they can offer that support and that help, and sort of pooling together resources so that we can best support survivors and their animals. So I will say, when we talk about this work, it's a journey for all folks, but it's also what works best for your community. And so as we built our model and built our online learning center, we've designed that with that in mind. So there's not one solution. There's lots of ideas, models, strategies that you can take from, and then go work with your community partners to build your own programs.
Absolutely not one way to get it done, for sure. You're doing incredible work. What is your hope moving forward? What's next? You've got this in action. What are your hopes for, say, a year down the line?
Yeah, for sure. I'll start, although I know that we certainly all have many hopes for where this project will go. So we've heard from some of our stakeholders that because of the work of the ACT project, their organization has been able to, for the very first time, support a survivor alongside their animal in fleeing gender-based violence. And so I certainly hope that we can keep celebrating successes like that, where one survivor at a time, we can build a more supportive infrastructure for women to access safety. But beyond that, I really hope that the infrastructure that we're building can help to raise awareness about the violence link, and that it starts conversations and creates call to action for us to do better in reducing gender-based violence in the first place and in advocating for safe, accessible, and animal-friendly housing. I'll pass it over to Andrea.
Thanks, Claire. I think a common theme that comes up when we work with survivors and their animals is resilience. Like we often hear stories of people being like, wow, that person is so resilient to get through that time. And their dog showed a lot of resilience. But I hope that for the future, there won't be a need for resilience because it's exhausting to be resilient all the time. And I hope this isn't, in a year from now, but in the future, I hope that we can continue to work together and advocate for those structural and systemic transformative changes. And so that, being resilient isn't the only choice that survivors and animals have.
And like Claire and Andrea highlighted, the goal of this project has always been to create systemic change. And my hope moving forward is we will continue to uplift the voices of survivors and of organizations to be able to support that systemic change. But specifically, I want to highlight there's a need to support and offer resources and funding to the incredible work Indigenous leaders and champions are already doing in the space of supporting survivors of gender-based violence in their communities. And I really hope we can uplift their work.
Well, listen, I have great faith that with the three of you working hard behind this, great things are going to happen and continue to happen. This is very cool. Listen, if someone wants to learn more about Humane Canada, about the ACT project, about the work you're doing, where can they go? Where can they find out more?
For sure, there are a few different options. So the first thing they can do is subscribe to our newsletter. So the ACT newsletter is quarterly, and we send out updates about our project, and that includes notifications about resources and learning modules that we're launching. And it also highlights, like Sue mentioned, the amazing work that's being done by our project partners. And so you can subscribe to our newsletter at humanecanada.ca/act-project. And we've also mentioned our quarterly community of practice. So these are virtual meetings, and they're a space for professionals working with survivors and their animals to come together and learn about a particular topic and supporting survivors from guest speakers. And so there's a regional networking opportunity after the guest speakers give presentations, and you can discuss the specific barriers and successes of providing services in your area with others, or you can choose to join another area and learn from another place. And our next community of practice, like Sue mentioned, is in October. So it's October 19th. And the topic that we're focusing on is supporting Indigenous communities and survivors of gender-based violence. So if you want to attend, we would love to have you. We would ask that you'd reach out to our team via email so that we can send you a registration link. And I will get to the contact in a moment, because the last thing I want to share about is our online learning center. So our newsletter will also highlight the launch of the online learning center, which, like we mentioned, is happening in October. And this will feature really something for everyone. So it'll have our asynchronous learning modules, and that'll include courses that are geared towards the general public, animal service providers, and human social service providers. And it will also be where you can find our resources, including tools and templates, which can be used by organizations working with survivors and animals. And like Andrea mentioned, we'll be having our case studies there, where we'll be showcasing all the different ways that this kind of work can kind of manifest and is happening all across the country. So it'll be a really interesting really interesting thing to be able to explore. And you can find recordings to our previous community of practice meetings in case you are interested in watching those. So if you have any questions about the project itself, or if you want to discuss collaborating with us, or if you'd like to get the link to register for our community of practice, please reach out to us. Our team can be reached through sue@humanecanada.ca.
And that is amazing. What about social media? Humane Canada all over social media?
Yes, thank you so much for asking. Yes, it is. It is Humane Canada on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, pretty much anywhere you can look for social. That's where we're at. And yeah, the Humane Canada website is humanecanada.ca.
Cool. And there's something coming up in Halifax. What's happening in Halifax shortly? What can you tell me about? Are you going to be there?
We sure are.
We sure are. Sorry. We're very excited to be speaking at the conference, at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference.
And what's your? I'm pretty sure it's called. So what is the official title of your? So we can look for it. We want to fill up that room. People got to know more and learn more and duplicate and support what you're doing.
Absolutely. I just want to quickly double check. So I'm just pulling up.
This was not in the script, people. So I put her on the spot.
I want to make sure I get the title right because we are presenting at a couple different conferences. So our title at this conference is Intersections Between Homelessness and Women with Animals Experiencing Gender-Based Violence. Act to Keep Families Safe.
Okay, all right. Amazing. Check that out. I encourage you to do so. It is an awesome conference, made even better with speakers like the three of you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for what you're doing. It's incredible. It's impactful. It's important. And I so appreciate all the work that you do on a daily basis and giving some of your precious time to us to chat about it today. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for
having us.
All right. We will see you in Halifax, but we'll also see you next time on the way home.